When the Titan Protocol is initiated, the world as we know it will be transformed by a force of unimaginable power. Experience the epic scale of our latest sci-fi drama, where humanity meets its greatest challenge. Click subscribe now and be there for the activation of the future.
My mother told my aunt that I was the stable one at Thanksgiving, the year I turned 27. She said it like she was bragging, like raising a daughter who never asked for anything was an achievement she could take credit for. I was standing in the kitchen doorway when she said it. She didn't know I was there. My sister had just announced she was taking a semester off from graduate school, her second semester off in 3 years, and my mother's response was to immediately start problem solving. Call the department, talk to the advisor. Maybe she could audit courses and still keep her stipend. My father was already reaching for his phone, and then my aunt asked, almost as an afterthought, how I was doing, and my mother said it. The stable one. She doesn't need us to worry. I went back to washing the dishes I'd been washing before I overheard any of it. I dried them. I stacked them in the cabinet the way I had reorganized that cabinet 6 years earlier when I moved back to help after my father's surgery, and no one had ever rearranged it since, and no one had ever asked who did it. That's the thing about being the stable one. Nobody notices the infrastructure until it's gone. The call that ended everything came on a Tuesday in March 2 years after that Thanksgiving. My father called to tell me the family was planning a trip to Napa for my parents' 40th anniversary. My sister had suggested it. My brother-in-law had found a rental house that could fit 6. My parents, my sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. 6. There are 7 people in my family if you count me. I waited through the pause that followed, the pause where my father would say, "Of course we're figuring out how to include you." The pause where the math of 6 people in a 6-person house would get corrected. The pause stretched. He mentioned the dates. He mentioned that flights were getting expensive. He mentioned that my sister's kids had never really experienced wine country, and it would be good for them to see something outside of Ohio. I said that sounded like a wonderful trip. He said he knew I'd understand. He said it was only a week. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. My apartment was quiet in the way apartments get quiet when you've lived alone long enough that silence stops feeling lonely and starts feeling like the most honest thing in your life. I'd been here 4 years. I'd painted every room myself. There was a plant on the windowsill that I'd kept alive for 2.5 years through nothing but stubbornness and a watering schedule I'd written in a notebook. I thought about all the times I had been the one who handled things. I handled my father's medical paperwork after his hip surgery because my sister was in her first semester and couldn't take time off. I handled my mother's car situation when she got in a minor accident on I-71 and couldn't navigate the insurance company alone. I drove 4 hours round trip to help them move a piece of furniture they bought on Facebook Marketplace from someone in Columbus. I did these things without being asked and without expecting anything, and for a long time I told myself that was generosity. Sitting at my kitchen table that Tuesday, I finally understood that it wasn't generosity. It was a survival strategy that had outlived its original purpose. I had made myself so useful, so reliable, so undramatic, that my family had quietly reclassified me. I wasn't someone they needed to include. I was someone they could count on to be fine about being excluded. I was not fine. I just didn't say so, because that was the deal I had accepted without ever being asked to sign it. My name is Hazel, and I need to tell you who I was before I can tell you who I became. Growing up, I was 3 years older than my sister, and that gap meant something different in our house than it might have in other families. My sister was the one who needed more. Not because she was difficult, but because she was expressive. She cried when she was sad. She yelled when she was angry. She performed her feelings in ways that demanded response, and my parents responded, because visible emotion is easier to address than quiet competence. I was quiet. I read books in my room. I got good grades without anyone checking my homework. I applied to college without anyone sitting down with me to talk about it, because by the time I was 17, the precedent had been set. Hazel handles her own things. My sister applied to 8 schools with my mother sitting beside her for every application. I applied to 3 and told my parents after I'd already sent them. My mother's response was pride. "Look how independent she is," she said to my father. "We raised her right." What she meant was that I had learned not to need her in ways that required effort. I got a partial scholarship to a state school in Michigan. I worked 20 hours a week at a campus cafe to cover what the scholarship didn't. I graduated in 4 years with a degree in accounting and a credit score I had built from scratch. My graduation ceremony fell on the same weekend as my sister's regional dance competition. My parents went to the dance competition. They sent me flowers with a card that said they were proud of me. I kept the card for a long time. I'm not sure why. Maybe because even second-hand acknowledgement felt like something. After college, I moved back to Cincinnati for 2 years, got my CPA license, worked for a regional firm. Then I moved to Chicago because a better opportunity came up and because staying in a city where I knew my parents would need me for everything and thank me for nothing was starting to feel like a slow leak and something I needed to keep pressurized. I told them I was moving. My mother asked if I was sure. My father said the cost of living in Chicago was very high. I said I had done the math. That's the thing about growing up the way I grew up. You get very good at math. Not just numbers, though I was good at those too. The math of what's worth hoping for and what isn't. The math of what you can build if you stop spending energy on things that will never pay out. I moved to Chicago on a Saturday in September. I rented a truck by myself. I loaded it by myself with help from a friend from work. I drove 5 hours and unloaded in 90-degree heat. My parents called that evening to ask if I'd arrived safely. My sister texted 2 days later to say she'd been meaning to check in. That was the whole send-off. I built a new life in Chicago the way I'd built everything else, methodically, without audience. I got promoted twice in my first 3 years at the firm. I started taking on clients independently. I began to understand that the skills I had always used to manage my family's expectations, reading people, anticipating problems, communicating without triggering defensiveness, were actually quite valuable in a professional context. My clients trusted me. My colleagues asked my advice. I was 31 when I made senior associate. I was 32 when I started seriously considering going out on my own. My family did not know any of this in detail. When they asked how work was going, I said fine. When my mother mentioned that my sister was having a hard time with her dissertation committee, I listened and offered no equivalent disclosure. I had learned too well that sharing good news with them meant watching it get rerouted. My promotion would become a segue into whether I was making enough to afford a house. My professional success would become evidence that I didn't need support the same way my sister did. So I kept it quiet. I kept a lot of things quiet. I kept quiet about the savings account that had grown substantially over 5 years of living below my means in a city where I earned more than I ever told my parents. I kept quiet about the financial planning certification I'd added to my credentials. I kept quiet about the 2 clients I had already begun working with independently on evenings and weekends, building the foundation of something that would eventually let me leave the firm entirely. My family thought I was a CPA at a mid-size firm in Chicago. That was true, but it was the smallest version of the truth. The biggest version was that I had spent 4 years doing quietly what they had never thought to credit me with doing loudly. Building something entirely on my own, using exactly the self-reliance they had always praised without ever recognizing as a response to their neglect. I went home for Christmas that year. This was the December before the Napa call, before everything changed. I drove down to Cincinnati on the 23rd and stayed in my childhood bedroom, which my mother had converted into a craft room sometime around my 28th birthday without mentioning it to me. There was a daybed in the corner under shelves of yarn and a sewing machine I'd never seen used. I hung my clothes on the back of the door because the closet was full of fabric bins. My sister and her family had the guest room, which my parents had repainted and furnished with a new queen bed the previous year. My niece had a pack and play in the corner. I said nothing about any of it. I cooked. I helped my mother with the grocery run. I assembled my niece's new tricycle on Christmas morning while everyone else was still in pajamas because I had noticed the box sitting in the garage 2 days before and understood that no one else was going to do it. I did the dishes after Christmas dinner. I wrapped the leftovers. I drove my parents to the pharmacy on the 26th when my father's prescription needed picking up and his knee was bothering him. My sister and her husband took the kids to a movie. Before I left to drive back to Chicago, my father pulled me aside and told me he was grateful I was always so helpful. He said my sister had a lot on her plate. He said it like explaining something I hadn't noticed. I drove 4 hours back to Chicago without turning on the radio. 3 months later, he called about Napa. I spent a week after that call being quieter than usual even by my own standards. I went to work. I made coffee. I watered my plant. I did not call my parents, which was unusual for me. I was typically the one who initiated contact, who asked questions, who held the threads of the relationship together. When I stopped holding them, nothing happened. Nobody noticed for 8 days. My mother texted on day 9 to ask if everything was okay. I said yes, everything was fine. The lie was so automatic I didn't even register it as a lie anymore. It was just what I said, a reflex. The verbal equivalent of reflexively cleaning up after people who never clean up after themselves. Something shifted in me during that week of quiet. It wasn't anger. Anger was too combustible, too expensive. It was more like a recalibration, a slow, deliberate re-examination of every assumption I had made about what I owed my family and why. I owed them nothing more than I had already given. That recognition didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived as arithmetic. The sum of what I had contributed versus what had been returned, the years of showing up invisibly, of being thanked in the form of being assumed capable of handling more silence, more exclusion, more benign invisibility. I started doing different things with my energy after that week. Small redirections. I stopped initiating calls. I declined to spend a weekend in May helping my parents sort through the basement. Something that had been requested with the light, casual certainty of people who have never had a request refused. I said I had work that weekend, which was true, though it was work I had scheduled specifically to have a reason to say no. I said no for the first time in 32 years, and nothing catastrophic happened. My mother called to check in and sounded slightly confused. My father sent a text that said he hoped things weren't too hectic. My sister, predictably, didn't notice at all. The absence of catastrophe was instructive. I had spent 32 years behaving as though my value to this family was contingent on my continued availability, my continued usefulness, my continued willingness to be the one who asks for nothing and receives it reliably. I had been afraid that if I stopped being those things, I would stop existing in their peripheral vision entirely. What I discovered instead was that I had been barely visible even when I was doing everything right. That summer, I made 2 decisions that I told no one about. The first was to formally launch my own practice. I had been building toward it for 2 years, accumulating clients gradually, keeping the paperwork clean and the transition planned carefully enough that I could leave my firm without burning a bridge I might need. I gave my notice in July. I spent 2 weeks at a rented house in Michigan I'd found on a whim, alone by a lake, working through the business filing and the client communications and the quiet terror of having built something real and being the only one responsible for it. I cried once, briefly, because I was 32 and completely alone in the most important moment of my professional life, and no one in my family knew it was happening. Then I stopped crying and kept working. The second decision was about Napa. My family was going in September. I had checked the dates. I had also, in the months following the phone call, quietly planned something for myself during that same week, a trip to San Francisco, ostensibly for a financial planning conference I'd been invited to speak at. The conference was real. The speaking invitation was real. I had not mentioned any of it to my family. I also booked a hotel in the city rather than a flight back home to an empty apartment. I extended the trip by 2 days. I made reservations at places I had wanted to eat for years. I made arrangements for myself the way I had always made arrangements for everyone else, with the same care and the same attention to detail, except this time the arrangements were entirely for me. When my father called in late August to confirm the Napa dates, in case I wanted to fly out and join them for a day, an afterthought, a crumb. I told him I was actually going to be in California that week for a work engagement. There was a pause. He asked what kind of engagement. I said I was speaking at a conference. He said he hadn't known I did that kind of thing. I said there was a lot he didn't know. I said it pleasantly, neutrally, the way I had learned to say difficult truths, and then I said I hoped they had a wonderful anniversary trip and I would see them at the holidays. He didn't know what to do with that version of me. He recovered quickly, the way he always did, and we hung up. The conference was in the 3rd week of September. I flew into San Francisco on a Sunday morning and took a car to the hotel, which had a view of the bay that I sat looking at for 20 minutes before I unpacked, just because I could. I was registered for the conference under my new business name, my own name, just mine, the name I had filed with the state in July. The first day of the conference, I gave my presentation to a room of about 200 people. It was a session on practical financial planning for first-generation wealth builders, people who were creating financial stability without family models, without inherited knowledge, without the safety net of people who already knew how this worked. I had written it from personal experience without saying so explicitly. Several people stayed afterward to ask questions. A woman from Atlanta told me it was the most useful thing she'd heard in 2 years of attending these events. I ate dinner alone that evening at a restaurant near the water. The food was extraordinary. I ordered a second glass of wine because I wanted one. I thought about my family in Napa, an hour and a half away. I thought about what they were doing. I thought about the rental house with 6 beds, about the wine tasting they were probably doing, about my niece picking grapes somewhere scenic while someone took photos for social media. I did not feel sad. That surprised me. I felt like I had finally gotten somewhere I'd been traveling toward for a very long time without knowing the destination. Like the distance between where I was and where I was supposed to be had finally collapsed. My mother called on the 3rd day of the conference. I was between sessions, standing outside in September sunshine with a cup of good coffee. She said she wanted to hear my voice. She asked where I was, and I said California, the same as last time we talked. She asked how the conference was going, and I said it was going very well. She paused and then said, not entirely comfortably, that she hadn't realized I was this established in my work. That one of my cousins had seen something online. Apparently a conference post had tagged my new business and had mentioned it to my mother. My mother said she didn't know I had my own business. I said I had launched it in July. She said she hadn't known. I said I know. The silence was long enough that I counted 4 beats of my own heartbeat. She asked why I hadn't told anyone. I said that I had spent a very long time telling people things about my life and finding that the information didn't seem to register. I said I had learned that the surest way to protect the things I was building was to build them where no one was looking. I kept my voice even. I wasn't angry. I was just telling the truth for the first time without softening it for someone else's comfort. My mother said that wasn't fair. I said I knew. I agreed with her. It wasn't fair. A lot of things about how our family worked weren't fair, and this was one of them, and I was done organizing my life around the fairness they hadn't been willing to extend to me. We finished the call without resolution. She said she needed to think. I said that was fine. I said I hoped the anniversary dinner was wonderful and that I'd be home for Thanksgiving. I walked back into the conference with my coffee and listened to the next session about estate planning for blended families and did not check my phone again until evening. The ride home from San Francisco was quiet in a different way than I was used to. Not the quiet of being unseen. The quiet of having been exactly where I needed to be and having handled it exactly the way I was capable of handling it. When I got back to Chicago, my apartment smelled like the candles I'd left burning in the diffuser, and my plant was doing fine, the stubborn, reliable thing. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat after the Napa call 6 months earlier, and I thought about what came next. My business was real. My conference was over. I had done something genuinely hard and done it completely alone, and it was worth doing. My phone had messages from my mother. A voicemail from my father, measured and uncertain in a way I had never heard from him before. A text from my sister that said she'd heard I'd been in California and sorry we didn't get a chance to connect. Sorry we didn't get a chance to connect. As though I had been a flight connection to catch rather than a sister they had not thought to include. I sat with the messages for a while without responding. Not to punish anyone. I just wasn't ready to have the conversations that would inevitably circle back to their comfort, their understanding, their adjustment period. I had been adjusting my whole life. They could have a few days. My father called again in October. He was different on the phone. Not apologetic exactly because he didn't have the vocabulary for it, but careful, deliberate. He mentioned the Napa trip in a way that suggested he was approaching it rather than avoiding it. He said they hadn't thought through how it would look. I said I appreciated that. He said he wasn't sure how things had gotten the way they were. I said it had happened gradually, through a lot of small decisions that probably didn't feel like decisions at the time. He said that seemed right. We talked for almost 40 minutes, which was longer than we had talked on the phone in probably 5 years. I told him about the business, not defensively, just matter-of-factly. I told him about the conference. I told him about the guam from Atlanta who had stayed to ask questions. He listened. He asked follow-up questions, real ones, not the perfunctory kind I was used to. Before we hung up, he said he was proud of me. I believed him. That was the strange thing. After everything, after 32 years of being the invisible stable one, I believed him when he said it, and it still mattered. Not more than it should, not as much as it once would have, but enough. Enough to land somewhere real. The holidays that year were different. Not fixed. Not the movie ending with everyone in a circle realizing what they'd done wrong and pledging to do better. That's not how families actually change. Families change in small, unromantic increments. A phone call that lasts longer than expected. A text asking a real question. A dinner where someone notices you've been quiet and asks why instead of assuming you're fine. My mother called to ask what I wanted to do for Christmas. Not to tell me the plan, to ask. My sister texted me a link to an article about financial planning for freelancers and said she thought it might be useful, and then added, separately, that she realized she hadn't asked about my work in a long time and she was sorry. I sat with that text for a while too. I wrote back that I appreciated it, that I was doing well, that I'd tell her more about it when I saw her. I went home for Christmas. I slept in the craft room on the daybed, but someone had cleared the shelves above it and put a lamp on the side table and left fresh towels on the corner of the mattress. It was a small thing. It was a real thing. My brother-in-law asked about my business at dinner and let me answer for 10 full minutes without redirecting the conversation. My niece fell asleep in my arms after dessert, the way she used to when she was a baby, and I sat with her longer than I needed to because it felt like something I had earned. I did not do the dishes that night. My father did them. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Some things you receive quietly, not because you've learned to accept less than you deserve, but because grace doesn't always announce itself. What I know now, what I understood somewhere over the bay that September, with a second glass of wine and a dinner I had ordered for myself, in a city where I had gone because I had accomplished something worth celebrating, is that the stable one is a role. It's a useful role to other people and a limiting role to you, and you can lay it down. You don't have to burn the family down to do it. You don't have to issue an ultimatum or deliver a speech or prove anything. You can just quietly, methodically stop organizing your life around other people's convenience. You can let the silence last long enough for people to start wondering what happened to the sound you used to make. Some of them will reach toward you when they realize you're no longer reaching first. That has to be enough. That imperfect, belated reaching has to be enough, because the alternative is waiting for a perfection they don't know how to offer, and you will wait your whole life. I know because I almost did. I built my business. I spoke at a conference. I drank good wine alone in a beautiful city and called it exactly what it was, a celebration and a beginning. My family is still learning who I am. I'm still deciding how much of myself to show them. But I stopped deciding from a place of fear, the fear that showing less would mean losing the small portion I already had. What I understand now is that the portion was always smaller than I thought, and building my own table didn't diminish what they had. It just made me someone they had to actually choose if they wanted me there. They're choosing, slowly, imperfectly, the way people do when they finally run out of the easier option. That's enough for me, today. Tomorrow I'll reassess. The stable one learned a long time ago to take things one calculation at a time. I used to think the hardest part was being overlooked. I was wrong. The hardest part is realizing you participated in it. Every time I said I'm fine when I wasn't. Every time I drove 4 hours to help and drove 4 hours back without anyone asking how I was doing. Every time I swallowed a piece of good news because I already knew how it would land. I was teaching my family exactly how to treat me. I was showing them over and over that I could be counted on to need nothing, and they believed me because it was convenient to believe me. That's not a criticism of them alone. That's just how it works. People treat us according to the information we give them. I gave my family 32 years of information that said, she's stable, she's fine, she handles things. The cause produced the effect. The effect was a 6-person house in Napa with no 7th bed. What changed wasn't them. What changed wasn't them just in bed. What changed was me deciding to give them different information, not through a speech, not through a confrontation, though that's what I'd always imagined it would take. I just stopped performing the role. I stopped calling first. I stopped volunteering. I built something real, my own practice, my own name on a filing, my own keynote at a conference where 200 people came to hear what I had to say, and I built it quietly for myself, with no audience, and then I let the silence speak. That silence required something I don't think people talk about enough: patience with your own integrity. It's easy to stay small when it's comfortable. It's harder to stay quiet about your growth when some part of you desperately wants to be seen. There were moments I wanted to call my mother and tell her about the client who said I'd changed how she thought about her own financial future. I wanted my father to know I had done something worth knowing about, but I had learned from experience that announcing myself in that family meant waiting to be minimized, and I wasn't willing to let the things I was most proud of be made small. Hazel didn't blow anything up. She didn't issue ultimatums. She just stopped shrinking, and in the space that created, the space where her family expected her voice and found silence, something shifted. Her father stayed on the phone for 40 minutes. Her mother asked what she wanted for Christmas rather than telling her the plan. Her sister sent a real apology, imperfect and a little late, but real. That's the thing about cause and effect when it comes to the people who love us imperfectly. When you change what you're putting in, the output eventually changes too. Not always. Not perfectly. But often enough to be worth the discomfort of the transition. The lesson I carry from all of it isn't about revenge. It isn't even about being seen. It's about what happens when you stop measuring your worth by the attention of people who were never paying close enough attention to measure it accurately. You start measuring it yourself. You build the table, you set a place at it, and you discover that sitting at your own table alone with a good meal and a clear mind is not the consolation prize. It was the goal all along, and nobody told you that you could just go get it. I went and got it. You can too.